Cool. Welcome to Money Making Conversation Masterclass. I'm your host, Rashawn McDonald. I recognize that we all have different definitions of success. For you, it may be the size of your paycheck. Mine is inspiring people to accomplish their goals and live their very best life. It's time to stop reading other people's success stories and start writing your own. People always talk about their purpose or gifts. If you have a gift, lead with your gifts and don't let your friends, family, or coworkers stop you from planning or living your dreams. My guest is Dr. T.M. Robinson-Mosley, affectionately known as Mosley. In this show, we will call her Dr. Mosley. She's a counseling psychologist and sports mental health expert, which is very, very important. It seems to be out there now, and it really, we want to talk a little bit back because it wasn't exposed like this. So we had a lot of years and decades and maybe even centuries of athletes who had this invincibility role they had to play, couldn't show their vulnerability, or people would have deemed that as weak. She's the principal and the managing partner of Mosley and Associates Consulting, which is the umbrella brand for counseling and psychological services, sports performance consulting, inclusive, belonging to training, and culturally responsive leadership development. Dr. Mosley developed the sports mental health and wellness playbook, a cutting-edge turnkey solution to one of the most challenging issues in sports, and she needs an app. The mental health needs of athletes. Please welcome to Money Making Conversation Masterclass, Dr. T.M. Robinson-Mosley. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well this morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited. I know we've had a little disconnect here and there, but I wanted to get you on the call today, and the video to talk about this because, you know, like Kevin Love a few years ago came out and admitted that he had some issues, and we see more and more athletes coming out. I watched my daughter, who was a tennis phenom, and I don't know if, I always told my wife, I don't know if that's what she really wanted to do. She was just very good at it. And so that's a psychological drama moment you have to deal with, that you have children out there doing things or functioning in a role that they may not be doing, but they just want to appease the parents. So what role do you play in all this, Dr. Mosley? Because we're going to back up a little bit and so we can move forward to fully understand why it's so important to you, and is there an end game to all of this?
Well, thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate your perspective too, because you've had a firsthand experience of the pressures that come with being at the highest level of sport. And it's not just the athlete, it's the people in their ecosystem that are impacted too. So their families. So that's something even to talk about. But the role that I play largely is working with these organizations so that they can build winning team cultures and winning teams. And by doing that, to make sure that we are invested in giving them a full service program that really empowers them to develop inclusive, empathic leaders so that these leaders can lead with tools and a game plan on how to kind of foster a culture that's conducive to high performing teams. Right. Because it's not just enough to make sure that the athletes or the coaches and the trainers and folks have the tools that they need to be successful on the field. The things that happened beyond the game impact what happens during the game. And so it's not enough for me to show up and make sure that the athletes have the resources and the tools and strategies if we're sending them right back into an environment that's not conducive to getting the absolute best out of them. So the Wellness and Peak Performance Playbook program is kind of a custom designed high intensity, high performing approach, specifically for leaders as well as the teams and the athletes. And we've helped over 40 organizations across collegiate and professional sports. And those teams have won championships. And so we're connecting that peak performance, mental health, and well-being are connected to winning. And that's the key.
Here's the key conversation too about there's a physical side of mental health, and there's a mental side of mental health. And let's slide back to the physical side. When sports in general start admitting there is a problem, we're talking about concussions, and admitting that we're athletes going out there who are either concussed, which means they were incoherent, and they would give them that smelling salt. They stagger back out on the field. And if they didn't go back on the field, some people might say they were weak or a sense of toughness. Now, because if we can talk about that, because then after that was exposed, then we start talking about the mental issues of mental health, because if you can't expose one without admitting something to the other. And I think the bigger problem is not so much the concussion, it's the admission that I don't feel good, I don't feel right, I'm uncomfortable, I need help. So am I right in talking about the concussion exposure from a physical side led to more exposure to the mental side?
I think talking about CTE and talking about concussions, particularly in the NFL, opened the door for some conversations around that, because it ended up being something connected to a phenomenon that was connected to sport.
Yes.
I think the interesting thing is that our mind and bodies are interconnected. There's no separation. And we always say in our business that injuries are not just physical, because when you're injured, it impacts your ability to function, let alone kind of in your sport, but beyond it. And there's an exchange there. And the challenge is that even when we are looking at injuries, the concern is, am I going to get back to where I am? Am I going to be able to perform again? If you're not at a place where you are able to rehab and have a lot of support around you, it can be a real challenging process and can be even more detrimental to the initial injury as you try to recover. Because not only do you have the pressures of, am I going to be able to get back to where I was, you are extremely isolated and lonely. And that also leads to some behaviors that can be really challenging.
Right. We're talking to Dr. T.M. Robinson-Mosley, affectionately known as Mosley. We'll be calling her Dr. Mosley on this show. She developed the Sports Mental Health and Wellness Playbook, a cutting-edge turnkey solution to one of the most challenging issues in sports, the mental health needs of the athlete. One of the things that we've noted a lot is in the Black and brown communities, these are words that you don't hear: therapy, mental health, depression, trauma, and worries to cope, or what are the resources? Let's start with therapy. And then let's go, because I don't want to lump them all together. Okay.
Sure.
So in the Black and brown community, why is the word therapy not brought up? And how can we make it a normal form of conversation when it comes to care?
Well, I love that we're even saying it even more. So I'm a second generation psychologist. My mother is a psychologist, and her twin sister. And so I grew up in the business, so to speak, in the business of caring, as I like to say. And many of the aspects of mental health, which you hit on, I think, really nicely in your opening, have been heavily stigmatized. I'm weak. Or I'm not going to perform, or I'm not enough. It's from this deficit place. And for us, we want to change the game and change this conversation. And what's great is we're having more and more people, particularly young Black men and women, who are at the forefront of talking about this. DeRozan and Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, who have been extremely vulnerable, yet extremely powerful in being able to make this a part of platforms, because we don't get to peak performance if we don't take care of ourselves. And so I always reframe therapy as a way that it's very similar to your physical health. If we're going to get checkups and get our physicals every year, if we're going to do things to make sure our bodies are well, we have to do the same things for our minds. So there's a common misconception that when I say mental health, it's conflated with mental illness or mental disorder. And that is not the case. Everybody has mental health like they have physical health. And we've got to do things to make sure that we check in. And therapy is a non-judgmental, safe, professional activity, very similar to being able to go and see a medical provider, where you're able to make sure that whether you have a big problem or you have something that you're grappling with, that we can do some preventative work to make sure it doesn't get to a place where it's worse. And we're in the middle of a mental health emergency right now across the lifespan, especially with our young people in particular. And so it's now more important than ever that there's access to culturally responsive therapy, and to have people who look like me and look like you to deliver those services. And that's exactly what we aim to do and what we provide to these world-class brands and organizations.
Now, depression.
Yes.
Like I said, just speaking of myself, I'm a type A driven, goal-oriented person. If I get down, I'm motivated to get up by setting goals. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. And that's where the word depression sets in, because if you can explain to my audience, what exactly is depression, and what are the signs?
So that's a great question. And I love that you asked that and talking about personal experience, because we all have experienced a really difficult time over the past couple of years. And we are seeing a lot of people using words like depression and anxiety really regularly, which I love. And at the same time, depression is not just feeling down a day or two, or maybe you're not feeling great. A depression diagnosis happens when, if you are having the worst day that you can have, and you have that uninterrupted for a minimum of 2 weeks to a month. Right. So if you are experiencing sadness, hopelessness, if you're feeling fatigued and extremely more tired, even if you're getting a lot of sleep, or if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're noticing that there's a shift in wanting to do or not do the things that you typically would want to do, there's a sheer shift. So depression really is a place of not just thinking about depressed mood and I'm feeling down and out, but there are all these other indicators that you may not be doing so well. So for us, it's less for people to know what the diagnosis is and more of, and we take this from sport, the fit test, right, where you are looking at the frequency. Am I experiencing something more common than I am? Am I feeling like I don't want to do things I want to do? I'm having a difficult time concentrating. I'm sad. The intensity of it, does it feel really extreme and severe? And then the timing of it. How long is this happening? So we want people to be mindful, not just of themselves, but the people they care about the most. If they're starting to recognize there's been a shift for people in a negative way, and that it's happened for an extended period of time.
Wow. When you was talking, I heard the word motivation. If you're not motivated to get out of bed, if you're not motivated to talk to your friends, if you're not motivated to go to work, if you're not motivated to treat yourself good, that's a sign of depression. And when I heard you, that the word motivation just popped out. That really is about motivation. If you've lost your will to feel good, to express happiness, to give happiness, then you are exhibiting signs of depression. And because that's what drives me. I'm motivated to get up. I'm motivated to come to work. I'm motivated to eat food. I'm motivated to hang out with my friends. If I lose those forms of motivation, then there's something wrong with my life and I should seek therapy.
Yeah. Or at least at that point, being able to, if you don't have a therapist or know how to get one, either going to your primary care provider, talking to someone who you think you can help, because sometimes people don't recognize it, which is why we have to look at it as there's the internal and the external. So yes, this is internally happening with us, but it's in response to what's happening around us, things that are happening with our families, with the environment, with our communities, with the greater environment. When we're looking at COVID and all these shifts, there's a lot of grief. We have a lot of collective trauma that's happening right now. And so it makes sense that there would be that difficulty. I will add this additional point too, to the point of thinking about talking about Black folks and brown folks. This may look very different than what people are used to seeing. So often, sometimes when if we're thinking about folks saying like, oh, she's got an attitude, or she's always so irritated, that could be a sign of depression. Or he or she is always so angry, right? Or they get set off real easily. Those things often are what we see too, as indicators with some of these other aspects that folks can be depressed. So you can see how sometimes it can be harder for people to recognize when people are having a really hard time.
Yeah. The thing about it so far, what I wanted to make sure that, sports and everyday life really intertwine, because sports is competition. And if you don't know this, in life, you're competing. You're competing for gas prices and how you get to work, time on the freeway, Uber, food, meals. And so people need to understand that. They say, why are you talking about she's sports? No, I'm talking about everyday life. And if you break it down to normal things, you realize that it's some tragic things happening to our young generation. And when I go to this area, it's called suicide attempts. So let me just state some quick facts, and I'm going to have Dr. Mosley expound on this. Suicide attempts increased amongst adolescents aged 12 to 17, especially young girls, during the COVID-19 pandemic. According to CDC data, suicide attempts among young girls surged by more than 50% during the pandemic. That is a giant wow for me. Please explain.
Yes, we are in the middle of a really serious state of emergency around mental health, particularly in this population. And athletes and young women are a unique subset. And I'll add boys in there too as well, because we're seeing the numbers of deaths by suicide and suicide attempts skyrocket. And this is across every single community. And if things were already kind of pre to COVID, we were starting to see those rates go up. But where those were cracks, now we're seeing shatters, right, because COVID has really impacted this. And so there's a combination of several risk factors here. And ideally, there needs to be more research here. But the risk factors being feelings of hopelessness and isolation, which makes sense from the online school and shutdowns, all of the grief and loss around COVID. If there's been a family history of someone who's either died or attempted, or close friends, if we're seeing a kind of a larger amount of people in the community, so a local epidemic of suicide, which is what we're seeing, because we've seen these kind of high profile deaths by suicide here recently. Those things impacted, as well as barriers to accessing culturally responsive care, accessing people like me, or anyone who's able to recognize what these warning signs of distress are. I have to say, and we'll probably take this here a little further, but social media also plays a huge role in this, because not only are you disconnected from people and isolated, but you have a larger comparison group that you are not able to manage what you're seeing and what you're experiencing. And young women and young girls in particular are more likely to be cyberbullied. And these kids don't have the awareness that this is something temporary when things live on the internet forever. Right. And so we are seeing so many different factors where, and the same thing when you're looking at entertainers, which I know you know, right, and professional athletes and elite athletes now are getting younger and younger, where people have access to them through the internet and are able to see them. And so pressure breaks pipes. And so they are the canaries in the mine that something is happening right now with our young people.
Right. Throughout her career, Dr. Mosley has served as a subject matter expert and advisor of numerous nonprofit organizations, companies in the private sector, collegiate athletics, professional sports leagues, and higher education, including world-class organizations like the Harvard Business School, the NCAA, NBA, NFL, and United States Air Force. You have been considered a trusted advisor to a lot of chief executives. How do you, or what in your career, when you did light bulb go off that your brand was being accepted, and when you picked up the phone or you sent out the email, you got the response back that you wanted, Dr. Mosley?
That's a great question. I guess in my career, so I did what some folks did. So I am, by trade, I'm a counseling psychologist, but for about 15 years, I was a higher education executive. Right. And what started happening to me is I started getting pulled more and more and consulting with my colleagues at my institutions and then also with other places around how do we empower our leaders and give them tools and resources to foster a culture, because you're doing something that's working, fostering a culture that's conducive to high performing teams. And can you help us? And to be frank, those calls started coming more often and often when I was in my full-time gig. And then the last role that I had, I was Associate Vice Chancellor and Dean of Students in the UC system at UC Santa Cruz. And the switch for me was when my job became my client. Right. So I started doing this work because my purpose and my passions really align around making sure that people can do their absolute best and getting the absolute best out of people, giving people a safe place to land, which means we have to empower leaders to be agile so that people feel psychologically safe and that they belong to something, so that our teams can innovate and thrive and ultimately win. That became the moment for me when I started seeing that there were real kind of outcome measures and impact to the work that I was doing. So moving and starting my own shop and getting some brilliant folks around me to help me do that became the path.
Now, there's always different paths to success.
Yes,
You
indeed.
started out, you're a sports junkie like we all, Saints fan. You pain and
Who
suffering
asked?
with those NFL referees, I'm sure, over the last few years. And then Drew Brees retires on you, and then he's hinting he might come back. That might send you into some mental health zone out there for a lot of fans. But I'm gonna share you an example of how sports, and I had to walk away from sports, being a particular sports fan. And I'm from Houston, and I will every Sunday I'd watch the Oilers play. And when they would lose, I actually felt like I had a hole in my chest. I was just not happy. I was just, and I started realizing that was carrying into my everyday life, that depression. I got to use the word depression because I think that's what it was. And then when I said it, and then when I made the conscious decision that I was just going to be a fan of sports, I was not going to be passion driven by a certain team and deal with their ups and downs and all that. And I've been able to handle my relationship with sports a lot better, because I think I still can say I'm a fan of a Houston team, but I'm not so engrossed that that's my team. That's my team. I live and die with that's my team. But now they're part of the sports which I follow. I track the Astros. I track, the Rockets. And that has worked out better for me. Is it because I changed my technique that's helping me out, or am I doing something wrong?
Well, what I love is that you were able to identify that something was impacting you in a way that didn't feel good and wasn't actually, let's say, performance enhancing, right? Like you were not able to feel good and do your best. And so you shifted your technique and your routine and the way that you connected. Right. And so frankly, in our business, it sounds like you developed some healthier boundaries with something that you really enjoyed and you were really connected with. And so that approach actually is really excellent. And it's what we really aim to do when working with teams and organizations and individuals. How do we think about healthy boundaries? And boundaries are things that people think are rigid. Right. And I reframe that, because boundaries simply just give us a roadmap for how to connect with each other. So what's okay and comfortable and safe for me, what's okay and comfortable and safe and kind of enhances performance for you in both ways. And we take it from there. So we can change our relationship and connection to something with healthy boundaries, instead of either being all in or all nothing. Right.
Well, I had to share that because, like I said, I clearly remember those Sundays. I clearly remember the depression. I'm gonna use the correct word. It was depressed because I was depressed. I was like, because you've heard stories, people throwing things at their TV, people knocking, people.
Listen, we were called the Aints. People went to the game with the bags on their head. Right. I'm with you.
Right. So what we're leading into July, which is the National Minority Health Awareness Month. Let's talk about that and make sure why that's important to be on my show talking about July being National Minority Health and Awareness, because we spoke about the people in the Black and Brown community being the last to talk about therapy, the last to talk about mental health, talk about the trauma, seeking out resources. Let's talk about that July and its significance in our community.
Yes, well, I think this year in particular, especially even more so in the last few years, this becomes even more important because with COVID-19 exacerbating the mental health crisis that has disproportionately impacted marginalized communities and Generation Z, it's really critical for us to look at the best ways to help people take care of themselves. There has been, I can't underscore this enough, the collective grief and trauma we've experienced, not only from things that we've lost and people that we've lost that we will never get back, but we are forever changed by this experience. And for some of us, not in a way that is healthy and will impact their health for a very long time. So having the focus on what this experience and phenomenon and what some kind of mental health indicators that things are not going as great or that things are going really well, couching that in what that looks like for our communities, for Black and Brown communities is especially important because we're not often focused on that. And so being able to highlight mental health providers, that would be excellent for the community. How do you recognize when your family member or loved one or your children are having a hard time? What do you do about that? And so we are at the intersection of all of these things. I always like to say we like to identify these strategies and tools that are important, but also culturally responsive, which means it really reflects your experience. And then I have a team, I call them my bullpen of experts, where we are a diverse team of mental health and medical providers who are accessible and provide these services. And so it's access to people who look like you and kind of treatment recommendations and support that really speak to your experience.
Well, I'm speaking to Dr. T.M. Robinson-Mosley, affectionately known as Mosley. I call her Dr. Mosley. My whole thing is that she developed the Sports Mental Health and Wellness Playbook. I just want you to remove the word sports out. She has developed the Mental Health and Wellness Playbook. It's a cutting edge turnkey solution to all of the challenging issues in life, not just sports. And I brought her on my show to let you understand that mental health issues that you see on TV, because these high profile athletes are publicizing and making admissions that something's not right in their life, and they want to sit down, they want to walk away from the game. This game may not be the sport I envision to be my career. It's a good thing. And I want to thank you, Dr. Mosley, for coming on my show and sharing some of your time, and definitely want to bring you back. Like I said, and just really get into the corporate side and also the student side and the academic side. We touched on it, but like I said, I wanted to bring you on the show to talk about what you needed to talk about, your recognized brand as a sports mental health expert, also the month of July. But this is a bigger picture you're playing out there, and we need to definitely continue this conversation in an ongoing relationship.
Yeah, I agree. And I tell you what, we use sport as a conduit, as a framework, because at our best, sport can teach us really valuable things about belonging, getting the best out of people, overcoming adversity, being resilient and agile. And so we work with higher education, with technology, with nonprofits, even with the military and the government, with special ops and the Air Force, around how do we do that in a way that builds empathic leaders and an environment that's conducive to getting the best out of people. So I would love to talk more with you about how we take that framework and we use it across these high intensity, high impact industries.
Which I say is good. You allowed me to share some personal stories. And I think by being honest about my stories, hopefully we will enable people to be honest about their lives. But again,
goodness, yes.
Thank you for coming on Money Making Conversation, Masterclass. Dr. Moses, you're amazing. I appreciate it. And I will see you in the future, okay?
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. Happy Friday Eve.
Absolutely. If you, my friend, want to see or hear any of my shows, please go to moneymakingconversation.com. My name is Rushion McDonald. I'm the host of Money Making Conversation Masterclass.